Remember the good old days when cars were real cars? I'm talking about the golden era of automobiles, back when we didn't need all of these fancy gadgets to get from point A to point B. These days, it seems like every new car is packed with more computers than NASA. But let me tell you something, there was a time when cars were simpler, dare I say better. Today we're going to take a trip down memory lane and explore 6 old car features that made cars what they are today. Features that these millennials and their fancy touchscreens wouldn't know the first thing about. Number 1, the trusty carburetor. Let's start with the heart of any good old car, the carburetor. Now, these youngsters out there might be scratching their heads wondering what in tarnation I'm even talking about. Well, time for some old school education. The carburetor was the lifeblood of our engines back in the day. It was responsible for mixing air and fuel in just the right proportions to keep our motors running smooth as silk. No fancy fuel injection systems, just good old-fashioned mechanical ingenuity. And we can thank a fella by the name of Carl Benz for that. Yep, the same Benz from Mercedes-Benz. He came up with the first carburetor for a gas engine back in 1888. These beauties were the go-to for pretty much every gasoline-powered vehicle up until the 1980s. That's when these computer-controlled fuel injection systems started taking over. Sure, fuel injection might be more efficient and environmentally friendly, but I'll tell you what, there was something special about tinkering with a carburetor. You could actually see and understand how your engine was breathing. Try doing that with all the plastic covers and electronics in modern cars. Now, the carburetor started phasing out in the 1980s and was pretty much gone by the early 1990s. Stricter emission standards and the need for better fuel efficiency pushed manufacturers towards fuel injection. But let me tell you, there are still plenty of us old-timers who miss the simplicity and character of a good carburetor. Because it wasn't just about making cars run. It was about giving us gearheads something to fiddle with on a Saturday afternoon. These millennials will never know the satisfaction of adjusting your carb and hearing that engine roar just right. Number 2, the iconic bench seat. But let's talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, the bench seat. The kids nowadays with their bucket seats and cup holders everywhere, they don't know what they're missing. Bench seats were the epitome of practicality and comfort. They have been around since the early days of automobiles, evolving from the horse-drawn carriage designs. But if we're talking about the classic bench seats that we all know, we can thank the American auto industry of the 1930s and 40s for perfecting the design. These were most popular in American cars, especially full-size models. From family sedans to pickup trucks, if you were cruising down the highway in the 50s or 60s, chances are you were sitting on a bench seat. Not only could you fit 3 people up front comfortably, but there was a huge convenience for us fellas when we were out on a date. No center console getting in the way of our romance. Now, bench seats started phasing out in the 1970s and 1980s, replaced by individual bucket seats. In fact, the last passenger car to offer a front bench seat was the Chevy Impala, which finally gave up in 2013. They were phased out due to safety regulations, they say, because bucket seats with headrests are supposedly safer in a crash. And then there's the whole center console thing. Apparently people these days need 17 cup holders and a place to put their smartphones. But let me tell you something, bench seats weren't just about practicality. They were about bringing people together. Literally. So, just a quick time out here, fellas. Before we move on to the rest of the video, could we please ask you for a small favor? If you have enjoyed the content so far, could you take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel? Over 98% of viewers who watch our videos do so without subscribing. It costs you absolutely nothing, but it is a really huge help to us in growing our small channel. Thanks. Now, let's get back into it. Number 3, the manual choke. Well, now it's time to talk about a feature that separated the men from the boys. The manual choke. Now, I can already see the confused look on boys' faces. Don't worry, I'll explain. The manual choke was invented way back in the early days of the automobile, right alongside the carburetor. It was a simple but effective device that helped get these cold engines started on frozen mornings. And pretty much everyone who drove a car before the 1980s used them. It wasn't some fancy optional extra. It was a necessity if you wanted to get your car running smoothly, especially in colder climates. So, what exactly was it? The manual choke was basically a lever or knob that you'd pull out when starting a cold engine. It restricted the airflow into the carburetor, creating a richer fuel mixture to help the engine fire up. Once the engine was warm, you'd gradually push it back in. But it took skill to use properly. Pull it out too much, and you'd flood the engine. Don't use it enough, and your car would sputter and die. It was an art, I tell you. Now, the manual choke started disappearing in the 1970s and 1980s, replaced by automatic choke, and then fuel injection systems. By the 1990s, it was pretty much extinct in new cars, which ultimately took away some of the connection between driver and machine. Number 4, the vent window. Now, here's something that'll really blow your mind. Vent windows. Also known as wing windows or quarter glass, these were little triangular windows right in front of the main side windows. They were hinged at the front and could be angled to direct air into the car. Simple, effective, and oh so practical. Vent windows evolved along with car design in the 1920s and 30s. By the 1940s, they were a standard feature on most American cars, and they were a godsend in the days before air conditioning became common. These little windows were used by just about everyone. Smokers loved them because they could ash their cigarettes without opening the main window. But even if you didn't smoke, they were perfect for creating a nice breeze on a warm day. Vent windows started disappearing in the 1960s and were pretty much gone by the 1980s. You might still see them on some vans or trucks, but they're a rare sight on modern passenger cars. Air conditioning became more common, so people didn't need them as much. Car designs also changed, favoring sleeker, more aerodynamic shapes, and power windows became standard, making it easier to roll down the main windows. But vent windows were more than just a way to let in air. They were a connection to the outside world, a connection that these millennials will never understand. Number 5, the floor-mounted dimmer switch. Now, another feature that's all forgotten these days is the floor-mounted dimmer switch. Now, youngsters might be wondering what in the world it is that I'm talking about, but understandable because I literally almost forgot that they existed. The floor-mounted dimmer switch was exactly what it sounds like. A switch on the floor that you tap with your foot to switch between high and low beams. And just about everyone who drove a car from the 1920s used them. It was standard equipment on American cars for decades. European cars tended to have the switch on the steering column, but us Americans knew the floor was where it belonged. Now, you might be wondering what happened to this marvel of engineering. Well, it started phasing out in the 1970s and was pretty much gone by the 1990s. These days, you've got your dimmer switch on a stalk behind the steering wheel. Progress, they called it. And it was also phased out for safety reasons, keeping both hands on the wheel and all that. Plus, with all the other electronic things in modern cars, it made sense to merge controls near the steering wheel. Number 6, the iconic pop-up headlights. Now, this last feature is something that I am still not over: pop-up headlights. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I want you to picture the coolest car you can imagine. Got it? Now make it cooler by giving it eyes that wink at you when you turn it on. That's pop-up headlights. These beauties were first introduced in the 1930s, but they really hit their stride in the 1960s and 70s. The first car to feature them was the 1936 Cord 810. They were most popular on sports cars and high-end luxury vehicles. Corvettes, Porsches, Ferraris. If it was fast and flashy, chances are it had pop-up headlights at some point. But what happened to them? Well, they started disappearing in the 1990s, and the last car to feature them was the Chevrolet Corvette, which ended production in 2004. It was a sad day for car enthusiasts everywhere. The main reason? Safety regulations and aerodynamics. Plus, with modern lighting technology, you don't need big, heavy headlight assemblies anymore. But pop-up headlights weren't just about functionality. They were about style, about making a statement. You pull up in a car with pop-up headlights, and everyone knows you mean business. Well, folks, these were the 6 car features from my days that actually made sense. Sure, modern cars are safer, more efficient, and packed with technology. But sometimes I can't help but feel like we have lost something along the way. Now, if you enjoyed this little trip down memory lane, why not keep the nostalgia going? Check out our video on 5 cars from the 80s that should have never been canceled. And don't miss our piece on 9 iconic cop cars from the 70s. It's a real walk on the wild side of automotive history. Thanks for sticking around, and I will catch you next time.